who is named as king, but we're going to briefly talk history, which I know is, I'm sure, all of your guys' favorite thing to do in church. But it's important to understand the political background of what's going on here. So, Belshazzar was never actually king of Babylon. Alright? In fact, the king at this time was a man named Nabonidus. Okay? So what happened is, at this point, Babylon, it is at war with the Mede-Persian army. And so Nabonidus has gone out to fight in that war, as every good king does, and has been captured. Well, while he was away, he named Belshazzar the king in standing, if you will. He was in charge during Nabonidus' absence. And so that is the background that we're working with here in Daniel chapter 5. So the reason it names him king is because to anyone underneath that station, there's no difference between the king and the king in standing. Alright? And we're going to briefly look over some of the relationships that are mentioned in here that ties him back to Nebuchadnezzar. There's a couple of different ideas because it does name Nebuchadnezzar as Belshazzar's father, which we also know from historical writings that is not the case. So there's two main ideas. Either Nebuchadnezzar could have been Belshazzar's grandfather on his mother's side, or he was simply given that title of father because of his previous position as king. Oftentimes they refer to previous kings as their fathers in title. And so as we go through this story, we're going to see a very black and white difference between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar in their character and in their personality. I want you to know that it's not that genes didn't get passed on. That Belshazzar is not Nebuchadnezzar's son, nor is he even the rightful king. We'll start in verse 1. If you want to turn to your Bibles, in verse 1 of chapter 5, it says, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. So we're going to stop right off that. Like I said, at this point, they're at war with the Medes and the Persians. Okay, and so it kind of puts all of this into a new context. Why is this man wasting time and resources on a grand feast when he's about to get sacked? In fact, his city actually goes through a siege. Now, it doesn't last very long because God intervenes and hands the city over to the Persians. But he is under siege at this time. And so we ask ourselves, why is he doing this? Why is he wasting his time and resources on a feast in the middle of a war? Now, a lot of commentators will tell you that it was Belshazzar's own foolishness that leads him to this action. I don't think Belshazzar was foolish. I think he was smart. You see, there's a political play here. The fact is, I believe the reason Belshazzar is doing this is to increase morale among the politicians in the city. He's trying to show the people that these Persians are not something to worry about. And we're going to see a couple signs of this as we go into this. So in verse 2 it says, Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So what's the issue here? Why is this going to cause God to be so angry with Belshazzar? Well, the fact is, these are items that are taken straight out of the Jewish temple. They were consecrated for the use by God and the high priest of the Israelites. Now they were taken because God allowed it. But until now, they have not been used for anything. They were religious items. They're not meant to be eaten off of and drank out of. The problem is that not only does Belshazzar violate this, he does so while praising false gods. Now, as I said, I don't think Belshazzar is a fool. I think what's going on here, because I believe that if he's as foolish as people make him out to be, this would have happened long before. This would not have been the first time that these were brought out in mid-party after a drunken stupor. I think what's going on here is he's putting on this feast to tell his supporters that this war is not something they need to worry about. That they're fine, they're safe, there's nothing to stress out about. And furthermore, he brings out the items from the Jewish temple to show them, to remind them of previous victories. So by bringing out these items that they get from the Jewish temples so long before, he's reminding them of the might of their armies and of their military. He's reminding them that they can handle the problem. And for all intents and purposes, it appears to work. But God takes great offense at this. He takes offense at the violation of his consecrated items, and he takes great offense that it's done so in the name of a false god. So in verse 5, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. And then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. Now, again, we're going to make reference to commentators, and I think that a lot of them have the wrong idea. They think that because Belshazzar was afraid at this, that he was somehow cowardly, or that, he wasn't as confident as he appears to have been. I think this is false. I think the fact is, if we see a hand appear out of nowhere and start writing in blood on that wall, every single one of us is going to be afraid. It doesn't matter how strong your army is. When something like that happens, you're fearful. That is a natural response. So I don't think Belshazzar is a coward. I think that he has every right to be afraid. Now, furthermore, we ask ourselves, why does his wise men, his magicians, all of these educated people, they can't read this writing? It's not in some angelic tongue, all right? I don't believe that Daniel had to be given inspiration to learn a new language to read this. It's written in Hebrew, okay? But the problem is that it's slang. It's not proper Hebrew. So if you've ever studied a foreign language, you can study that language all you want to. Greek, you'll run into this too, Chapin. You can study that language all you want to out of a book, and you can speak it and write it flawlessly. But the second you start talking to somebody on the street who has that as their native language, and they start giving you words you've never heard before, you run into a lot of problems. So the problem here is it's written in everyday Hebrew, words that the Hebrews would have used, because each word actually stands for a sentence. But we'll continue on so that we can get to that point. In verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of gods, were found in him, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers. Because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretations. Daniel has not even entered the picture, and already we're seeing another aspect of Daniel's personality, and that's humility. You see, Daniel has already done great things in this city. He's been a huge part of recent history. The greatest king they've ever had recognized him as the wisest man in his kingdom. And yet this king doesn't even know who he is. You see, I think that it's our prideful tendency to brag about our achievements. Now, a normal person in Daniel's place would have made sure that anyone sitting on the throne knew just how important they were. If I could tell you prophecies and listen to visions and give you interpretations, I'm going to let you know. But then I'm not as humble as Daniel is. So I think that once again we're given another aspect of Daniel's character that we can apply to ourselves. Daniel is content to serve in whatever way he's called to serve. He never actually looks for the next step up. He never looks for a promotion. Instead, he serves obediently, and God places those promotions in his path. I also want to point out that the queen knows about him. The queen has kept tabs on everything in the kingdom, mostly because it's not Belshazzar's queen. It's Nebuchadnezzar's, the rightful queen. And that's why she comes in and addresses him as formally as she does. In verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought in from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men and enchanters have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretations, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Now this is the second time he's made this offer, the third ruler in the kingdom. And this actually supports the previous point that I made, is that Belshazzar is not the rightful ruler. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar is first in the kingdom as rightful king. Belshazzar, as his king in standing, is the second in the kingdom. So the best he can offer is third. Now, as I said, that background just allows us to understand a few details in this passage. The purple coloring, if you're not already familiar with this, a lot of people are, but purple was the color of royalty. It's a way of showing that even among people of his own station, that person is raised up above them. You see, we take, for instance, a governor. Now, in our society, every governor is the same as every other governor. They just have a different area. But during this time, if you were given purple robes, you are chief of governors. You have authority even over people of your own station. This is essentially the greatest accolades that Daniel could be given by this man at this time. In verse 17, as we continue, we're going to see that Daniel doesn't really particularly care. It says, "Then Daniel answered and said before the king, 'Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another.'" You see, Daniel is aware of what is being offered here, but he's also aware of what they've done. I have no doubt in my mind that Daniel is aware of the items that are taken from the Jewish temple. Furthermore, he's been brought into this room where all of this stuff has been splayed out and abused in an ungodly fashion. We have every reason to believe that Daniel is just as angry as God is at this point. And knowing what we know about Daniel's character tells us that he probably was. He clearly does not have the respect for this man that he did with Nebuchadnezzar, because when he had to give bad news to Nebuchadnezzar, it was sorrowful. Almost like a brother giving bad news to a brother. But as we see here, this is a different side of Daniel's personality. He comes across as angry and aggressive. It says in verse 18, O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave them, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwellings was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Now I want to bring attention to Belshazzar's actions, this party that he's thrown. While I believe that there is a political purpose behind it, I think that there's another aspect that we can look at, one that applies to us today. You see, I think so often in today's society, we have this tendency to want to run away from a problem. And Belshazzar shows that in spades here. You have an army at your doorstep, your kingdom is surrounded. Not only is your kingdom surrounded, it's not even your kingdom, it's just been entrusted to you. And your response is to, instead of making sure that it's safe, throw a party, get drunk, and convince everybody it's safe. How often do we do that today? When life is hard, jobs can't be found, maybe our bills are coming up and we're having a hard time paying them, or maybe we're just dealing with a lot of stress in our lives. We find ways to get out of our own mindset. We find ways to bury those problems and to ignore them for a time. But as we see in this story, hiding those problems does not actually make them go away. Belshazzar can throw as many parties as he wants. He can stay as drunk as he wants. It's not going to keep the Persians out of the gates. In 24, it says, Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Peresin. This is an interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. I want you to know, Daniel is giving an actual interpretation here. Okay? And this is what I meant by it's not formal language. Each word is standing for an entire sentence. This is why nobody could translate it but Daniel, because Daniel was the only Hebrew that was involved in this group of people. Verse 27, Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. I want to take note of something here. Daniel had said, keep your gifts. And yet when he fulfills the obligation, he still receives those gifts. As Christians, we have a right and a responsibility to hold people to their word. So say you're doing a job for somebody, and I'm using this because I actually know a couple of people who've had this issue. If you do a job for somebody and they agree to pay you a certain amount, and then they refuse to pay you, there are people who would argue that the right thing to do as a Christian is to walk away and take your punches. But you have a right and a responsibility to hold men to their word, because that's what God does. God's very character demands that we are people of our word. If we say we're going to do something, he expects us to do that. And as Christians, we should be able to expect that from one another. So it doesn't matter that Daniel didn't care about the rewards. All that matters is that they were promised. And so when he fulfilled his obligations, those rewards were received. But Daniel puts no stock in those rewards because they are, in fact, earthly rewards. And that's not why Daniel was doing it. In verse 30, that very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, on another note of these rewards that Daniel had received, this purple cloak and this gold chain, and getting the third place in all the kingdom, there's a lot of times where we want these earthly rewards. And honestly, I'm one of those few people that tell you there's nothing wrong with earthly gain. The problem it comes from when that's our only desire. When the desire for earthly gain comes before our desire for heavenly gain, that's where the problem lies. But God has shown a tendency to bless his people. And if God has decided to make you a wealthy person, count your blessings. Enjoy that blessing. You have a right to enjoy that blessing that God has given you. Don't mourn what God blesses you with. But also keep in mind that those earthly blessings, they're temporary. And they can be taken away overnight. This is not a new concept. We see the same concept. We have an entire book written about this concept, the book of Job. You see, God gives us blessings because he loves us. But when he feels the need to, he takes them away. And it's God's right to take those blessings away. Daniel here shows a quiet obedience to God. Always being willing to do the task at hand, always keeping God first in his sight. Now God blesses him with earthly gain in abundance throughout this. But never once does Daniel let that become his focus. Never once does Daniel allow that to become his purpose. Always keeping his sight on God. And so when that's taken away, as it inevitably is, it doesn't even harm him. It doesn't bother Daniel in the least. Because he didn't put any stock in those anyways. Today we live in a society that counts our blessings by the number in our bank account. We live in a society that counts success by the number of vehicles sitting in your driveway, the number of rooms in your house. The fact is that today's societal standards is nothing new. I hear this all the time, people mourning and lamenting that the world is getting worse and worse and further away from God. I think what's happening is mature Christians are opening their eyes. Solomon said it in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. This idea of society being materialistic, it's nothing new. We're seeing it here in the book of Daniel. We see it in the book of Genesis. Society will always be opposed to God, as it always has been. You see, it's the job of mature Christians to notice it, to see it, and to warn people away from it. It's the job of mature Christians to make sure that the youthful Christians don't fall into those trappings. Make a parallel to the prodigal son. Mature Christians are the father in that story. And the young Christians, the new Christians, the immature Christians, they are the son in that story. Now, ideally, the mature Christians guide them in such a way that they never fall away from God, but sometimes they will fall away from God. And we have to be willing to accept them back. But sometimes we have to be willing to chase them down and bring them home. You see, we as students, we go around with a lot of churches that are struggling. Churches that are seeing less and less people every week. Sometimes as low as 4 or 5 people. And people are lamenting that the church is dying. People are lamenting that there's no youthful people coming in, no extra faith coming in from other people. But those are the same churches that aren't going out and finding them. Daniel lives his life in quiet obedience, and I'm a little sorrowful that we're actually getting to the last part of his narrative. Next week we'll go over chapter 6. But I want you to keep in mind all these characteristics that we're seeing by this man. And I want you to ask yourselves if you're portraying the same thing in your own lives. Are you a Daniel? Do you seek to serve God for God's sake? This afternoon, as we always do when we gather together, we've set aside a time. If you need prayers, if you need encouragement, if you need answers, or if you're ready to put on the waters of baptism and rise up a new creation, a child of God, we ask that you bring your needs forward and make them known. Help you see them as we stand.